Hello everyone, welcome to this presentation on the Attention is All You Need paper published by Google. The presentation will go as follows. I will first give some background information about the task of sequence transduction. I will explain some of the methods that have been used in that task for a long time and the new methods introduced by the paper. Then we will give some technical explanation about the transformer model, which is the new model introduced by the paper. I will explain all its different components and give some motivations as to why they've been using these new techniques. Then we'll go over the experiences and how the training was made and the results they got, and end up with some nice conclusion. So sequence transduction can be divided in two main tasks: computing a representation of the input and output, and then using these encoded inputs and outputs to compute a new output element one at a time. So here on the right, you have some example of a sequence transduction task applied to speech-to-text transformation. So we have this audio sample that comes in, hello, my dear friend. It's being encoded, and then it goes into the decoder, which is able to produce an output. The important thing is that here the input is being transformed. We're computing a representation of the input that then goes in the decoder. The decoder is then using all of the inputs, but also all of the outputs produced so far in order to generate a new output element one at a time. This property of using all of the inputs and all the outputs so far is known as an autoregressive model. So in the task of computing the representation of the inputs and outputs, which is sequence modeling, mostly RNNs have been used in the past few years prior to this paper. They were vastly used in this task and achieved state-of-the-art performance at that moment. An RNN computes along the symbols, tokens, in a sequential fashion, so because it's its recurrent nature. So there exists a fundamental constraint of sequential computation, which prevents us from doing parallelization, which is something we would like to do because it would allow us to train our models significantly faster. So most attempts to reduce that inherent sequential computation aspect have been involving CNNs. CNNs, convolutional networks, they're good because they allow parallelization and they exploit local dependencies, which intuitively fits tasks such as language in our case. So what does that mean? Is, well, if you take a sentence, it's fair to assume that every word has a strong dependency to its neighboring words. It's just like an image. When we use CNNs on an image, it works because every pixel is strongly linked to the pixel surrounding him. They have strong dependencies, and CNNs is a technology that takes this into account. However, the number of operations to learn dependencies between positions increases with the distance between them. So for example, if you take the sentence, Arno is a student from the AI class, he's doing his presentation right now. Well, you can see that Arno and he are words that have a strong dependency because they designate the same entity, but they're pretty far away in the sentence. So the farther away they are, the more operations we would need to learn that dependency, but it's an important dependency. So we can see that in a sentence, it's not necessarily the neighboring words that have the most impact. The attention mechanism has been used for a long time in the sequence transduction task. The idea is to focus on the relevant parts of the input and output. So here on the right, we can see an English sentence and its French equivalent, and we have some lines that connect words that are the most relevant between each other in both languages. So attention, it models dependencies without regard to distance, and that's a very strong argument that the model tries to use. They've been vastly used with RNNs to improve performance, and how the people would use them is that they would intervene between the encoder and the decoder. But the question that arose, and that was the general incentive for making this paper, was why not using it for the first task of sequence transduction? So why not using it for computing the representation of the input and output sequences? And this would be known as doing self-attention. So self-attention, you can see it as a way to relate different positions of a sequence in order to compute a representation of it. One of its main advantages, so just like we said earlier, is that there's a constant path length between any two positions. So we don't care really anymore about the distance between two positions. We will be able to compute the path length in a constant manner for all pair of positions. It has a variable size perceptual field and is easily parallelizable. So here in our example, we see 2 times the same sentence because it's self-attention, and we can see that the model has learned some dependencies. We can see that, for example, the law will never be perfect, but its application should be just. Well, law and its are strongly related, just like they are in the meaning of the sentence. So the paper idea is to get rid of these sequence-aligned RNNs and CNNs and use self-attention, so use attention only everywhere in the model. Hence, the name attention is all you need. And that is being done through the transformer model. So the transformer is that structure that you can see on the right. So just like most techniques in that field before, it has an encoder-decoder structure where the output of the encoder goes into the decoder. And it has this autoregressive property, which is, once again, that in order to compute a single new output unit, we're using not only all the inputs available, but also all the outputs that have been produced so far. What's new is that it relies entirely on attention mechanisms, and hence it allows significantly more parallelization, and it happens to have reached a new state of the art in translation quality. So it's not only quite better in terms of performance, but also in terms of quality of translation, but also quite faster. So now we'll explain each of these different components individually. So the encoder, you can see on the right, that little drawing on the right, if you take it 6 times, these are the components of our encoder. So each of these layers has 2 sublayers that can be either a multi-head attention layer or a feed-forward layer. The encoder uses residual connections, so the input that goes into the sublayer is separated and added at the output of the sublayer, and then it's being normalized. So it obeys this equation we can see on the left. The decoder is pretty similar. It's different in only 2 aspects. The first is that it has an additional sublayer that is performing attention over the output of the encoder, just like we can see here. The second is that it's using self-attention sublayer that uses masking to prevent positions to attending subsequent positions. That means that when we are computing the representation of the outputs that have been generated so far, we only want positions to attend to positions that come before them. This is done in order to conserve the autoregressive property of the model. So this first aspect here, the additional sublayer that's doing attention over the output of the encoder, is something that has been used previous to this paper. So attention can be seen as mapping a query and a set of key value pairs to an output, where key values in query and outputs are vectors. And the output is a weighted sum of the values, where weights are computed with the query and keys. So the transformer the transformer uses multi-head attention, which is essentially a parallelization of scale dot product attention. So we will talk about the multi-head attention later. So the scale dot product attention, it obeys this equation we can see here in vector form. So we have a single query and a set of keys and values. And what we're computing is a dot product. So we have q.ki. This goes into a softmax. It's being scaled first, but I'll explain that later. It goes into a softmax. And then we have a matrix multiplication between this result and the values, which is our weighted sum. We can have it in matrix form, where we simply have more queries. This obeys the equation we see with the softmax and matrix multiplication of q and k being scaled multiplied by v. The scaling here, which is represented by the division by the square root of dk, is being done in order to avoid the softmax from handling values that are too big and to avoid him exploding. dk is the dimension of the keys and also the query. So there are several ways of doing attention, but here this one using dot product is very efficient because matrix multiplication is very fast on modern hardware. So the multi-head attention is basically doing several scale dot product attention in parallel and then concatenating the results. But the addition is that all of these attentions that we're doing in parallel, we're mapping the queries, the keys, and the values. We're mapping them to different subspace representations. So the goal is to allow the model to jointly attend information from different subspace representations. So each head is then able to, for example, learn different semantics, different informations and structure about our input. It obeys this equation that we can see where we have a concatenation of all the heads and where each head is the previous attention that we studied. And these W's, WQ, WK, WV, they're just matrices that allow us to do this mapping, this linear transformation into different subspaces. Here we have an example with two different heads that were acting on the same sentence, and they've learned some different relationships. We can see that the red one, for example, has focused on very close neighborhood structure of the sentence, whereas the other one, the green one, appears to have learned some structure that are more into the sub-sentence parts of the sentence. So attention is used 3 times in the model. We have this encoder-decoder attention, which is nothing new. It's been used already before. And then we have these self-attentions that intervene both in the encoder and the decoder, and this is the novelty of the model. Once again, we can see that for the encoder, the representations, we have that all positions can attend to all positions, whereas in the decoder, as we said before, all position can only attend to previous positions in order to avoid a leftward flow of information and preserve the autoregressive property. Then we also have some feed-forward networks in the model, which are nothing particular. It's just 2 linear transformations with a relay activation function in between. And finally, we have this, which is on the low part of the model. We have the embeddings. So we use learn embeddings to convert the input and output symbols, input-output tokens to vectors of dimension D model, and some positional encodings to add some information about the positions in the sequence. So then this left part goes into the encoder and the right part goes into the decoder. So why using self-attention? Well, there are 3 reasons to that. First is total complexity per layer. Second is the amount of computation that can be parallelized. And lastly is the path length between long-range dependencies in the network. This table here summarizes the results and compares them to other techniques such as RNNs and CNNs. So in terms of total complexity per layer, it can be a bit frightening because if we look at self-attention, we can see that it's big O of n squared, whereas RNNs and CNNs are big O of n, where n is the sequence length and d is the representation dimensionality, which is the thing that the dimension of the vector from which to which the inputs and outputs are being mapped. So in practice, however, the n, the sequence length, is pretty smaller than d. It happens to be that most sentences can be, say, at around a sequence length of 60, 70. And in modern techniques, the representation dimensionality that is being used is roughly around 1,000. So even with a big O n squared d, self-attention beats recurrence. Onto the amount of computation that can be parallelized. Well, self-attention connects all positions of a sequence with a constant number of sequentially executed operations. So we are getting rid of that aspect that the RNNs had, where it needed to go over a whole sequence to compute its representation. So that would be linear in the length of the sequence. Now this is over because self-attention uses a constant number of operations to do that. So that's a very strong advantage and one of the reasons why the model was efficient. Lastly, we saw that the shorter the path between any combination of input-output positions, the easier it is to learn the long-range dependencies. So self-attentions, we saw that it allows modeling of dependencies without regard to the distances. So that's once again one strong advantage of self-attention over RNNs and CNNs as well, is that now there is no regard to distances, so we don't have to focus on this distance between long-range distance dependencies. The model was trained using an ADAM optimizer with parameters and an adaptive learning rate that first grows linearly and then decreases in the square root of the steps in the training. It uses dropout at output of each sublayer right before adding the residual and normalizing. So just like we saw earlier in the total model picture, it uses lateral smoothing as well, and it involves a lot of different GPUs. Two models were trained, a base model and a big model. The base model took roughly 12 hours to train, and the big model 3.5 days. So these are the results for the task that they chose to compute their, to compare with other models is the machine translation task. So it's both English to German and English to French. We can see that in English to German, the big model has achieved a new state-of-the-art score of 28.4. And that in the English to French task, well, it's also a new state-of-the-art score, but even the base model is performing very well in the English to German translation task, and every time it's at a fraction of the computation costs of the other methods. So there's a very strong results. Below is the score that is being used in these tasks to compare. And the model is performing very well and is also training a lot faster. The paper mentioned having the big model train at a quarter of the time required for the English to French task. And we can see here in the results that it's orders of magnitude below what was being done so far. So we saw that the transformer is a new model that replaces recurrent layers with multi-headed self-attention. It's the first sequence transduction model based entirely on attention. And this is one of the reasons why it was very interesting to the community is they were being using some technology that was known before, but in a novel way and to a very successful result. It can be trained significantly faster than architectures based on RNNs and CNNs. It has achieved state-of-the-art performance for these translations tasks. Well, thank you for your attention. If you have any question, feel free to ask them to me on the Moodle. And thank you for joining in.